Good evening in Moscow. My name is Joe Crescente, and we have this great event today with Jeremi Suri. Before I introduce him, I'm just gonna plug a few things. First of all, I run a media literacy discussion club. For those who don't know, you can find out more information about it on the American Center website. And I also run a new Telegram channel on digital literacy where I offer twice weekly tips on ways you can, tips on how to stay informed without getting completely overwhelmed by the media. And that is a bilingual resource in both English and Russian, and you can actually compare the two with one another. So it's a good learning tool as well. I'll post that for the administrators, and hopefully you could post that, please, into the YouTube chat there. This is the second event in the speaker series on digital literacy and history, a series that will explore how Americans have been involved and continue to be involved in the dissemination of media practices. This series will take place this spring and summer. And in particular, this series will feature a survey of historical events, along with a practical examination of how Americans produce, discuss, and teach media. And it is our hope that these presentations will allow Russians and Americans to identify common connections and learn from one another's experiences. For those of you who do not know Jeremi Suri, you're in for a real treat. Professor Jeremi Suri holds the Mack Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership in Global Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. He is a professor in the university's Department of History and the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Professor Suri is the author and editor of 11 books, and his writings appear in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, on CNN, in the Atlantic, Newsweek, Time, Wired, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy. Basically, that's the entirety of respectable media, just about in the United States, it seems like. And Professor Suri is a popular public lecturer and comments frequently on radio and on television news. His lecture is titled "The Second World War and Its Legacies" today. And with that, I will hand over the floor to Professor Suri. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. I'm delighted to be with everyone here and to join you for this discussion today. Media literacy is so important in our world, and I hope that our discussion today will provide a basis for at least better understanding the history of World War II, which is, I think, a history that is with us all the time. One of my arguments today is going to be that we are still living with the legacies of World War II. The war was more than 75 years ago, but nonetheless, it's a war that still shapes our world. We won't talk about current events today. We'll talk about this history so we can be better informed as we think about what that history means for current events in our world today. So we're going to talk about the Second World War and its legacies. And I just want to start with this first slide here. This is a map of Europe on the eve of American entrance into World War II. This is 1941 or so. It's worth looking at this map closely for a minute or two. I know it may be a little small on your screens, but as a historian, I love maps, and maps give us a way to really think about our world as we look at it then and today. We can see that in 1941, much of present-day Europe was under German occupation. We can also see that the Soviet Union had expanded in part through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939. The Soviet Union had expanded in agreement with Germany into much of what is today Eastern Europe. So we have a Europe on the eve of American entrance into World War II, a Europe that is not only divided between Soviet and German occupation zones, but a Europe that's mostly occupied. One of the few areas that remained independent in Europe at this time is Great Britain. And the island nation of Great Britain, of course, had been under attack from Germany. But with that exception, most of Europe on the eve of World War I is under fascist or communist Soviet control. This is really important on the eve of World War II. Here we have East Asia at the same time on the eve of World War II. This is actually a few months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So this is 1942. And we can see in this image here how much of Asia, much of East Asia, is under the control of Japanese forces. Japanese forces had moved into the island nations in Southeast Asia, moved on to the Southeast Asian peninsula, and even into mainland China itself. We see extensive Japanese occupation in mainland China. The world on the eve of American entrance into World War II was a world that was really largely controlled by foreign powers, a few foreign powers, communist and fascist, largely fascist. And the United States was entering a world that was going to be a very complex place for the United States to operate, where American power was distant and ill-prepared for the challenges that it faced. This is the world today. And that's the contrast I want us to think about. This is the world today. Here we see in our current world a European Union. That's what the orange countries are. Norway and Switzerland are, of course, associate members. They're part of Schengen. They're part of the travel procedures that the European Union has, but they are politically not part of the European Union. The European Union involves 28 countries, spanning from Poland and the Baltic states in the east to the west with Spain and Portugal. This is the current Europe of independent states that are part of a consensual union, which is, of course, very different from this world of Europe under largely German occupation and to some extent Soviet occupation. And East Asia today is actually a very complex international environment of multiple states with different regimes, different floating alliances, countries like Japan that have been allied with the United States since World War II, China, which is obviously pursuing its own independent foreign policy, North Korea and South Korea, countries that remain still at civil war, countries like Myanmar, Thailand, and others that have complex relationships to the world around them. It is also, like the Europe of today, a continent of many independent states. So the key point here is that World War II was a world of a few large states dominating the land masses of Europe and Asia. And the world today is just the opposite. We might have some large powers in the world today, but we have many more states that act independently, that are constantly vying for different kinds of support from other outside as well as internal actors, and a diversity of regimes. The world is far more diverse in its political structure today, in its political regimes, in its leadership, in its outlook, than it was in 1941, 1942. And how did we get here? What role did the United States play in getting us here? How is it possible that we could go from this world of fascist empires to a world of independent states today? It doesn't necessarily mean the world is better, but it's a different political structure to the world. And I think that change is what I want to talk about today, and the role the United States played. Now, I want to be careful to make the point that the changes we're talking about were not exclusively made by the United States. They were not changes that the United States was always in the driver's seat for. They are changes that occurred because of the nature of World War II and the nature of the evolving American commitment, both at home and abroad, to World War II. That evolving commitment, that evolving foreign policy and military policy by the United States that I'm going to focus on today is part of what brought us from a world of fascist empires to a world of independent states today. And the challenges we face today are both the positive and negative outgrowths of those historical changes in the World War II era. Why do we study history? We study history because it helps explain where we were and how we came to today. And it helps us see the different alternative pathways for today. When we look back, we see new ways of thinking about the future. I'm not going to talk about the future today. I'm going to talk about looking back. It's up to all of you as citizens, as scholars, as writers, to think about what the future can be based upon this historical experience, this historical knowledge. Okay, let me start with this man, Franklin Roosevelt. He was the American president during World War II, as most of you know, I'm sure. Franklin Roosevelt was elected in 1932 and became president in March of 1933. That's when the inaugurations for president were at the time. He inherited a country, the United States, that was still deep, deep in depression. A country for which the unemployment rate then was more than 25%, which is to say more than 1 in 4 Americans had lost their jobs during the Great Depression, during the downturn of the late 20s and early 1930s. 1 in 4 Americans had lost their jobs, and most households in the United States depended upon the income from one wage earner. There were very few parts of the United States, very few, that had any kind of unemployment insurance, any kind of mechanism for providing substitute income for those who had lost their jobs. He became president in exactly that setting. He became president at a time when the banks in the United States were failing. The stock market had crashed. The United States was in a shambles. And one of the main reasons that the United States was not a major international actor in the early 1930s, as the emerging fascist governments were, was because the United States was so focused on its own troubles internally. It was the fascist regimes in Germany and Japan in particular, as well as the communist regime in the Soviet Union, that were able to get their economies moving faster. In the mid-1930s, in the first years of Roosevelt's presidency, they were able to get their economies moving faster because of central control. They were able to force people back to work. They were able to take resources from the farms, from their mines, from various other sources, and force those resources into the economy to create productivity. The command systems, at least in the mid-1930s, were working better. The American system was not. And that's a very important part of what was known as American isolationism at this period. The belief many Americans had, many prominent Americans, that the United States had to stay out of these wars, stay out of the activities of fascists overseas, and stay focused internally on its own problems. This is a common way for Americans to react to their own problems at home. Franklin Roosevelt was not an isolationist. Franklin Roosevelt believed that the United States had to be involved in the world because he believed that the American economy depended upon being involved in the world. And he, from his own experience, especially as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I, believed that the United States had strong security interests abroad. But he couldn't pull the country into war when so many Americans, such a large proportion of Americans, were much more concerned about their own internal problems. Roosevelt pursued a set of policies known as the New Deal. The New Deal. And this is very important for understanding American foreign policy, because as is almost always the case, this is an important historical takeaway, American foreign policy is almost always based on domestic politics. It's not to say that American foreign policy doesn't have international aspirations, dogmas, beliefs, and assumptions, but domestic politics always condition, always shape American foreign policy because we are a democracy, and that's how democracies operate. And presidents are almost always elected on domestic issues, not on foreign issues. It's very rare that foreign policy is more important than domestic policy. So foreign policy is always being made in light of domestic politics. During this period of economic downturn, during this depression period that we're seeing an image of here, we're seeing an image of employed men who have become unemployed standing in a bread line. This is an image, by the way, that circulated within the fascist and communist regimes as a way of criticizing American capitalism. Roosevelt developed a set of policies that were designed to grow the federal government, for the federal government to play a larger role in people's lives, providing things that didn't exist before. Unemployment insurance, for example, but more importantly, creating jobs, work programs, the Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and many other organizations were created by the federal government, not state governments, to create jobs planting trees, jobs building pathways in national parks. If any of you have had the opportunity to go to the Grand Canyon, you walk on a national parkway that was actually created as a Make Jobs program at the time, building libraries. The Works Progress Administration created all kinds of domestic institutions to put people to work. The New Deal is about putting people to work. The idea is that if people have jobs and they have a routine in their lives and they have an income, a salary, they will be able to live more stable lives. This is very important for understanding Franklin Roosevelt's foreign policy. He articulated in January of 1941, so at the start of his third term, which had broken the precedent, most presidents only served 2 terms until this point. After Franklin Roosevelt, a constitutional amendment prohibits anyone from serving more than 2 terms. But at this time, Roosevelt was able to serve more than 2 terms. In January of 1941, he gave one of the most important speeches in American history, where he explained what the New Deal was at home, and he explained why it needed American activity abroad. If we were going to have jobs and freedom at home, he said, our foreign policy also had to protect the international space we operated in. He said the United States was about 4 freedoms. And I would argue to you, this is one of the most important speeches up there with the Gettysburg Address in American history, because it articulates as well as anything does what American domestic and foreign policy has been about historically. 4 freedoms. These are the aspirations, not always the achievements, the aspirations of Roosevelt's foreign policy on the eve of World War II. First, freedom of speech. That's that first figure on the far left. These are artistic depictions of Roosevelt's speech by Norman Rockwell, the great American painter and portraitist at the time, probably the most popular public artist in the United States, in some ways the chief propagandist for American politics at this time. Norman Rockwell puts the 4 freedoms into imagery for us. So on the left, we have this figure who looks like Abraham Lincoln, actually. Free speech. America will be about free speech for everyone in all places. Second freedom, on the far right. Far left is speech, far right, worship. Americans believe that everyone should worship whatever God they wish to worship in any way. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Number 3, freedom from want. That's the second from the right, the Thanksgiving meal. Isn't that beautiful, that big turkey? That's making me hungry right now. Freedom from want, that Americans want citizens here and around the world not to go hungry, not to be wanting. You can't be free if you are starving. And the 4th freedom, and this is my favorite, the little boys tucked in the bed by mommy and daddy, freedom from fear. You can't be free if you are fearful, if you are being bullied, if you are faced by fascist goons. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, freedom from fear. Roosevelt argues that what he's been doing at home has been using the federal government as it had not been used before, to give people jobs, to provide them security. That's where Social Security comes from, 1935 under Franklin Roosevelt. To provide people with pensions, with jobs, with protection in their lives, so they can speak freely, because they have a basis to live, so they can worship freely, so they can eat, and so they can be secure. That's what the New Deal's about at home. And he makes the case as Hitler's armies and the Japanese armies move in to take control of those territories I showed you in those maps. He makes the case to Americans that now this requires us to get involved in the world. Because if we stay away, while those who oppose freedom, those who destroy freedom, take these other territories, we will be cornered, we will be alone, we will be isolated, and we'll be unable to protect our own freedoms at home. That our freedoms at home require a safe, conducive, supportive international environment. It's similar to the argument Woodrow Wilson had made during World War I, that the world must be made safe for democracy. Roosevelt is not saying the United States should go around and dominate the world. He's saying instead that the United States should prevent someone else from dominating the world, so that there is freedom, openness, and protection for the freedoms that Americans believe in. That's his argument. That's his argument. And that's the argument he uses to justify, before Pearl Harbor, before American military action in World War II, to justify American support for Great Britain. It's very important that people understand that Great Britain had not been a traditional American ally. Americans were deeply suspicious of Great Britain, even during World War I, when we fought on the same side as the British. The British controlled the largest empire in the world. And the same reason that Germany, Japan, and Russia were critical of Britain, so was the United States. That empire was controlled by Great Britain, and Great Britain did not allow other countries to trade with that empire. So India was closed to American trade, for example, during this period. The British controlled the sea. The British controlled much of the most valuable territories outside of Europe at this time. Roosevelt, like other Americans, was critical of British imperialism. So he used his vision of the 4 freedoms when Great Britain came to the United States for help under aerial bombardment by Nazi Germany in 1940. Roosevelt used his vision of the 4 freedoms to require the British, in return for American support, to require the British to open up their empire. This is Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill meeting in August of 1941. This is before the United States is in the war. The United States is still neutral. And Roosevelt is meeting with Churchill to negotiate what became the Atlantic Charter. And the Atlantic Charter was a document agreed to by Churchill, where he agreed that the United States and Great Britain were working together to build a world of freedom, a world with a united nations, a world where all citizens would have rights similar to the New Deal vision articulated by Roosevelt. Roosevelt was requiring this vision of four freedoms to be attached to any support the United States gave to Great Britain. This was the beginning of the end of the British Empire in India and elsewhere. The British had no choice. If they wanted to protect their island nation and what they could of their empire, they needed American support. American support would only come with this commitment, a commitment the British hadn't made before, in essence, to ending their empire. And what kind of support did the United States give Great Britain? It still wasn't direct military support before Pearl Harbor, before December of 1941. It was what was known initially as destroyers for bases. The United States gave ships to the British in return for leases on bases in Britain. The United States sent food aid to Britain. The United States sent military aid to Britain. And then eventually, after Pearl Harbor, the United States would send what was known as Lend-Lease aid. Lend-Lease aid, which was basically military aid, massive military aid to Great Britain and to the Soviet Union to resist Nazi Germany as well as Japan. The key turning point for the United States, as everyone knows, is the attack on the American naval fleet at its largest Pacific base, which was in Hawaii. Hawaii was not a state of the United States. Hawaii was a territory that the United States had acquired in 1898 after a revolution fomented by American pineapple growers and others had overthrown the Hawaiian monarchy. That island, roughly between the west coast of the United States and Japan, that set of islands was under American control, and the United States built its largest forward Pacific base there. This was part of Theodore Roosevelt's vision from the early 20th century, by the way. And the Japanese used a combination of aircraft carriers and battleships to attack this position and destroy much of the American Pacific Fleet in a surprise attack on December 7th, 1941. This changed everything because now Roosevelt's arguments about supporting four freedoms abroad were not just arguments about concept and long-term interest. They were now immediate. Americans felt immediately attacked and brought into this war. And soon after, the United States declared war on Japan in response to this. Nazi Germany declared war on the United States. It's long been a question why Hitler did that. He did it largely because he felt the United States at this point was weak and he could take advantage of American weakness. And in response to that, the United States found itself at war with Nazi Germany as well as Japan. The United States, at the end of 1941, had an army of about 100,000 people, smaller than the Nazi forces that were in occupation of Western Europe. The United States had to rapidly build its military forces, and it did this just as it pursued the New Deal by creating more opportunities for more Americans who had been unemployed, not just to serve in the military, but to work in factories with government support, building government materiel. Eventually, the United States would build more aircraft per day than its adversaries built in a year. We would produce more food than all of our adversaries together. We would outproduce everyone. And in the early years of the war, we spent most of our time not fighting on battlefields, but sending those supplies to Great Britain and to the Soviet Union. It was actually American supplies that were the most significant source of resources beyond the native resources that the Soviet Union had in fighting Germany. It is not to say that American resources were more important. They were not. But it is to say that American resources, in Stalin's own words, were essential to the Soviet war effort from this moment forward. The dilemmas Roosevelt faced, the dilemmas the United States faced, were pretty significant. And I put up this slide because it's very important that we understand how difficult it is to actually manage a war like this. It looks so easy in retrospect. Roosevelt had a lot of difficulties. Being a wartime manager is actually being a political leader. It's not just being a war commander. As Karl von Clausewitz, the great military theorist of the 19th century, wrote, war is politics by other means. Roosevelt had to manage these politics. And these politics are important for us because they don't end with the war. They continue to today. Roosevelt had to think about a two-front war. A two-front war. Look at this. The United States is another map here. Here we see the Allied nations that the United States joins in green. The Allied nations, including the Soviet Union, The allied nations and the United States have to fight on two fronts. You can see the orange and red in Europe, that area I showed you on the first map, and the orange and red in Asia, right? So the United States has to fight two wars at once. I'm going back to these initial maps of World War II. The United States has to fight here, has to get all the way across the Atlantic to be able to fight here, to join the Soviet forces that are fighting from the east. And the United States has to basically fight an amphibious war. And as everyone knows, amphibious warfare is some of the most difficult to fight in an area that the Japanese have largely locked down in East Asia. A two-front war. Fighting one front would be hard enough. A two-front war is what the United States has to fight. It's a war for democracy in Roosevelt's terms, for four freedoms. But the United States is on the side. Its allies, as you look at this map again, are countries that have huge empires. Great Britain in particular. You can see the green of Great Britain, the small, tiny island nation, this blessed plot, as Shakespeare says. In the northern part of Europe, north of France, across the English Channel. And you can see the green in India, the Indian subcontinent, parts of Africa. Those were not allied because they chose to be allied. Those are parts of the British Empire. The Soviet Union had an empire too. Please remember that map I had shown you at the start for World War II. Again, come back to these maps are important. Look at those areas in purple controlled by the Soviet Union: Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Georgia. Many of these are independent countries. I think most of them are independent countries today. They were countries that had sometimes been part of Russia, sometimes been part of they've been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in some cases, the Ottoman Empire. It's not to say that the Soviet Union was doing something others hadn't done. The Soviet Union was an empire as well. The Soviet Union was in control of lots of lands that had not been Russian. Some of these lands, of course, Russians would claim as Russian, but others they wouldn't. These were not Russian lands that the Soviet Union was in control of. That is not to criticize. That is to say that the United States was fighting with allies who were empires. It was a war for democracy, but we were actually fighting with empires on our side. We were fighting against fascism, of course, the main enemy. The most horrible regimes of the 20th century, I think, were the fascist regimes. I think most historians would agree with that. But Americans were also deeply anti-communist, as we all know. That goes back to the Red Scare of the early 20th century. The United States had been an inhospitable place for communism, even for socialism in many respects. But now the communists were our main allies. Actually, the Soviet Union was the most important ally for the United States, as we'll see going forward. So Roosevelt had to balance that. And then, of course, we were fighting a total war. This was now a war that involved massive killing of civilians. This is the first war where massive aerial bombardment is used frequently. There was some of this during World War I and during the Spanish Civil War. But this is the first time that we have massive use of air power to bomb civilian targets, to bomb cities. The Germans do this bombing London. The Americans and the British do this bombing Dresden. The United States does this with reckless, flagrant activity in Tokyo, burning almost all of Tokyo down in 1945. We're fighting a total war, but we claim it's about human rights. How do you protect human rights when you're fighting a war like this? These are all dilemmas for Roosevelt. He can't choose one side. He's got to fight both fronts at once. He's got to fight for democracy, but also join empires. He's got to fight against communism, but also fight against anti-communism, even though the communists are his allies. He's got to fight a total war, but somehow protect human rights. Those are the dilemmas he faces. And it's really important because war strategy is not just about defeating the enemy on the battlefield. It's how you manage these dilemmas, how you manage what the war is about. And the unresolved tensions, ladies and gentlemen, the unresolved contradictions are the ones we still face today. That's modern warfare. That's modern politics for us. Now, this is an incredibly deadly war. This might be the most important slide I show you because it explains so much about the war and it explains so much about our current world, everything that happens from World War II to today. Again, I'm only going to talk about the history. Look at how many people, particularly the Russian and associated countries in the East, lose. This chart shows you the total number. That's the bar, the red bar. I think that's red or maroon. My wife says I'm colorblind, so I'm not sure what color that is. It's reddish brown, whatever it is. Those bars are the number of people who died as a percentage of population. So more Russians died than Belarusians. Almost 17 million Russians died. Total Soviet deaths are about 30 million if you take the whole Soviet Union. But Belarus, where you have 2 million, a little more than 2 million deaths, that's a quarter of their population. So what's important here? The total deaths, but also the proportion of the population. 1 in 4 Belarusians die during World War II. Almost 1 in 5 Polish citizens. Everyone see that? 1 in 5 Ukrainians. In the rest of the Soviet Union, almost 1 in 5. Latvia is close. Lithuania. Notice that Germany has a lot of deaths, but its population is large, and there are fewer deaths than in the Soviet Union. And so a smaller proportion of the German population is devastated. Notice as you go down the list how few Americans died in comparison to the deaths in the Soviet Union. And notice also what a small percentage of that population it is. What does this graph tell you? It tells you that for the next half century, and maybe longer, the countries at the top that lose so many, sometimes much more than Germany, they will face a huge demographic and resource shortage. They will simply not have the people to build growing, strong economies. It will be very difficult. The most able-bodied young men are dead. The most able-bodied young men are dead. The resources, the buildings, have been used for military purposes and they've been destroyed. The buildings, the energy sources, the industrial sources, it's all been depleted and destroyed by war. It is hard for Americans to understand how devastated these societies were. The closest we come is looking at our own Civil War, and even our own Civil War is nothing close to the death and destruction that you see in the countries at the top of this list, in the Soviet Union and the countries around it. Those countries are devastated. And I would argue that Russia to this day has not recovered from the losses, from the suffering of this war. The United States, in contrast, and Canada, and Britain, and even to some extent Italy and France, they face so many fewer losses as a percentage of their population that in some ways they come out of the war stronger. The United States loses about 1%, less than 1% of its population, but the other 99% has gained resources they never had before. Americans who are taught skills in the Army or in various factories, given experience with the wider world, given an opportunity to leave their small towns, this is what you see in so many of the oral histories, and become internationally engaged, to become educated as they weren't before, to become skilled as they weren't before. The poor, illiterate farmer is now the literate, educated engineer because of 3 or 4 years in the military or in a factory. African Americans, the grandchildren of slaves from Alabama, South Carolina, my own Texas, are sent up to Michigan, to Chicago, to work in factories. They become skilled, unionized wage earners. The city of Detroit, which has the largest migration next to Chicago of African Americans moving north, becomes the part of the United States with the highest per capita income after World War II because of the wages in these factories that are producing tanks and airplanes, and then later cars and toasters and other items after World War II. The United States gets stronger, demographically more vibrant, and after the war, Americans have more children than they've ever had before, the so-called baby boom. So we become a more populous, resource-rich, engaged, powerful, wealthy, educated country, as those in the East go in exactly the opposite direction. That is not policy as much as it is the consequence of the war. Wars always have a differential effect on different groups, and that differential effect is deeply felt in the differences between East and West coming out of World War II. At the Tehran Conference in 1943, I love these meetings. They show the United States working with its British and Soviet allies. Here you see Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. Roosevelt's always in the middle. The country set out to think about the post-war order and to manage it as what Roosevelt calls 4 policemen. The United States, Britain, Soviet Union, and the nationalists in China, Chiang Kai-shek, who is a close ally of the United States as well. Those countries, Roosevelt says, will manage the post-war order. That's the basis, ladies and gentlemen, for what becomes the Security Council in the United Nations. France is added as a fifth. George Kennan is a prominent American figure. He's the highest-ranking civil servant in the embassy in Moscow. He is present in all the meetings with Stalin, often the translator in those meetings for the ambassador Averell Harriman. And George Kennan sets out a policy of American containment, which is to say that after the war, we will rebuild the areas in the West that we occupy, Western Europe, as well as East Asia, and we will try to keep communist influences as well as fascist influences out. This is the beginnings of the post-war tensions that we already see in the war between just what I said, Roosevelt's desire to work with the Soviets, but also not to see the Soviet Union increase its power after the war. The Yalta Conference in 1945, Roosevelt's last conference before he dies, February of 1945, really shows this new world emerging. Europe is divided coming out of Yalta. Poland is under Soviet control. Germany is divided east and west. Japan is under American control. There's a divided Cold War world emerging both from the alliance of these countries, but also from their desire after the war to protect their own spheres, to create their own spheres of control. And those spheres of control become imprinted in the way people think about the world even to this day. Which countries are in the rightful control of other countries? That's the debate we have today coming out of this period. There are major problems in rethinking how we move forward as a world that have to do with domestic politics as well as international politics. Remember, I said that all foreign policy is domestic policy. The internment of Japanese, the United States interned 120,000, basically forced them into preventive detention, not concentration camps. They weren't killed, but 120,000 Americans, American citizens of Japanese descent, had been moved from their homes forcibly and put into camps, put into preventive detention during the war. This is a real concern about civil freedoms in the United States. It becomes controversial soon after the war. And of course, there's the question, the much larger question of the 6 million Jews. I'm Jewish myself, so I feel this very personally. 6 million Jews who were annihilated, many more who were killed not by the Nazis, but killed in Poland and elsewhere, killed by Polish and Russian and other soldiers, Jews and other minorities. What's left of those populations, where should they live? Many societies don't want them back. The United States doesn't want them, even though we've taken in a number of Jews during World War II. We've taken far fewer than we could. And there's a question as to where these Jews, the survivors of this horror, will go. And of course, that's the beginnings of the creation of the State of Israel and many of the controversies we have in the Middle East today. And of course, the atomic bombs that end the war. It's the use of 2 atomic bombs by the United States. This is the first one. This is the uranium bomb used over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. And there's Nagasaki. Thankfully, these weapons have not been used in war again. The United States is the only country that uses them in war. And as soon as they're used, of course, the question is, how do we prevent them from being used again? How do we prevent the Soviet Union from getting these weapons? One of the reasons for the rift between the US and the Soviet Union after the war was Stalin's concern that the United States had this powerful weapon, and his anger, perhaps legitimate, that even though he was an ally of the United States, these weapons, this technology was not shared with him. The United States shared knowledge and worked closely with the British on developing these weapons. It did not work closely with the Soviet Union. That was Roosevelt's decision. Stalin was an ally, but not that kind of ally. In the words of my students today, he was a friend, but not a BFF. And so you didn't share this stuff with him. Stalin had used espionage to gain information about this. And it's not just the weapons, it's the frayed relationship that's key to much of the distrust that precedes World War II. Within the United States, as I said, the resources coming out of the war are unmatched. The United States comes out of the war wealthier than it's ever been, more engaged. That's not why we went into the war, but the spending on the war, the mobilization of citizens makes the United States so much stronger, and our population grows back and grows larger very quickly, whereas other societies are devastated, particularly the Soviet Union. The United States comes out of the war and makes a commitment to actually have the most educated citizenry any society has had before. And we fulfill that commitment. It's through the GI Bill, the Servicemen's Adjustment Act of 1944, that provides for the first time ever federal money for middle-class kids who went off to fight in the war to come home to buy a house and to go to college. And between 1945 and 1970, the United States will educate more young people through its universities and colleges than any other society. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the basis for Silicon Valley. That's the basis for the Austin tech boom. That's the basis for so much of the knowledge economy that the United States becomes the leader of. It's educating so many people who never would have been educated before. Before World War II, something like 15% of Americans go to college. By 1970, it's about half. It's remained about half, 45%, about half to today. The United States moves finally to begin true civil rights reforms. These are partial, these are resisted, these are often sources of major controversy, and they're incomplete to this day, as we know. But it is in 1948 that the United States, under Truman's order, President Truman's order, desegregates or begins to desegregate the military. And as always, the military is a leading agency for civil rights reform. The military is the most public of course, our large employers in the United States. And once the military starts integrating, that opens up and creates an imperative for other parts of society to start integrating. This is very important for the integration of schools, that the integration of the military actually begins before the integration of schools. Women during World War II in the United States entered the workforce as they had not before. There was no choice. This was true in Russia as well. This was true in many other societies. Women went to the factories as the men went to the front. And women don't just go home after the war. There are lots of controversies over this as well. But there's a sense of women's empowerment, women's engagement, and what many would call the second and third phases of feminism occur at this moment, where women demand inclusion. Women show, just as African Americans and others did, that they could be part of doing important public work and should therefore have public representation as they didn't before. You will begin to see more women elected to Congress. You will begin to see more women running businesses. It's a slow process. It's, again, a difficult process, but it's a fundamental transformation. And the United States becomes a leader in the world because its women, in some ways, are leaders in the world. And here we see what this means for the world economy. The world economy is much smaller this only goes back to 1960. But in 1960, this is just 15 years after the war, the United States is 40% of the world economy. As the world economy grows, the United States grows enormously too. Its proportion of the world economy decreases, but it's still incredibly a large portion of the world economy. We're about a quarter of the world economy. We're about 2% of the world's population and about a quarter of the world economy. Incidentally, China, which has a population 3 times the United States, is only 16% of the world's economy today. So the United States, you can see the trend it's on after World War II, which is to be the largest by far actor in the world economy, which it wasn't before. And it remains that. Even as the world economy grows and the American proportion decreases, we're still an inordinately large part and will be by every measure for a long time to come. And this is the basis for fundamental changes at home, too. The development of a large standing military. Those of you who know your Constitution, I hope you all do. The U.S. Constitution says there's an Army and a Navy, War Department and Navy. They're separate and small in peacetime. In fact, we developed the largest military with a military budget today that is larger than most of the other countries of the world combined, not because we're a militaristic society, though maybe we are, but because of the large obligations we took on during World War II and we continue to take on. This is an outgrowth of World War II. On the eve of World War II, the United States has about a dozen bases overseas. After World War II, the United States will build 750 military bases overseas. And again, some of this is to project American power. Some of this is to protect our allies. Much of this is what we think is necessary to protect those 4 freedoms, especially freedom from fear in different parts of the world. We can argue over whether these are good or bad. That's not the point. The historical point is that they're there and that they're outgrowths of World War II. They would not be there if it weren't for World War II. And there's a whole generation that leads the United States for whom World War II is the foremost lesson in leadership and foreign policy. Here we have 2 examples, President George H.W. Bush, who was a pilot during World War II, and one of my heroes, Senator John Glenn from Ohio. Both of these men have passed away. John Glenn was also a fighter pilot and then a pioneer of space activities for the United States from 1945 until 1992. For 47 years, every president of the United States is a World War II veteran. Most members of Congress are World War II veterans. Most CEOs of businesses are World War II veterans. That only changes at the end of the 20th century. And that's actually the transition the United States is still going through. From a generation of World War II veterans to a younger generation. You wouldn't know that from the two older presidential candidates we have now. But our politics are different. Most members of Congress now have never served in war. Most business leaders have never served in war. Most professors have never served in war and have very little direct connection to World War II. It's a world instead of the Pete Buttigieg's. I put him up as an example of a prominent American political figure who did serve in war, but served in Iraq, which is a very different kind of war, which leads to more cynicism, perhaps, more questions about what the United States should be doing in the world. It's a post-World War II generation for the first time in American politics, and that's part of the reason for the tumult and the uncertainty. Our old anchors are not really recognized and understood as well, and maybe the world is different too. One of my recent books, not my most recent books, one of my recent books, The Impossible Presidency, was about this. I put this up not just because I like putting up my book cover, I do, but to make a point about how hard it is for presidents to lead now, because these anchors have changed, right? What makes it a little easier to lead after World War II is there are clear assumptions coming out of the war. I show that the presidency gets harder and harder with every generation because there's more to do. The expectations are higher, but the common experiences aren't there. How do you lead people who want more and more, who expect more and more from the United States at home and abroad, but don't share the same experiences? World War II was a shared experience. After that, we don't have that to the same extent. Vietnam was not a shared experience. Some people served, many didn't. Iraq was not a shared experience. It's much harder to lead when you have a more diverse population without a shared set of experiences, but rising expectations. That's one of the challenges we face today. It's an outgrowth of World War II. And then the last thing I want to put up and encourage you all to participate in is a weekly podcast I do called This is Democracy. It's free. It's on all platforms. And we take issues on this podcast in our current democracy, issues like the rise of evangelical politics, issues like humanitarian intervention. And we bring on experts, not to talk about and pontificate on politics, we have enough of that, but to understand how history influences these issues and how studying this history can help us better understand these issues. That's what I've tried to do today. We study the history of World War II or the history of any issue because that history helps to elucidate the world we're in today and helps us to think about it more clearly as we debate policy. We can then debate policy based on fact, not based on myth and based on lies. It's so important that we debate, but we talk about facts, not about lies. History gives us a foundation for that. Thank you all for listening. I'm delighted now to take questions and comments, criticisms also.
Okay, thank you so much for the great lecture. I put a lot of things together for myself that I'd never thought about before. A couple questions from the audience. I have a couple questions as well. Don't know what to begin with. The questions that the audience asks, are a little more broad. Somebody asked, what could be considered one of the most, I mean, there's probably several, right? But one of the most significant watershed moments in World War II.
Yeah, so I mean, the obvious one that people point to, and I think it's correct, is Stalingrad. In the Battle of Stalingrad, for the first time, the Soviet Union, which has really been on its heels as after the German attack on the Soviet Union on June 6, 1941. After that attack at Stalingrad, which is about a year and a half later, Soviet forces are finally able to push back German forces, and they develop new means of warfare, citizen warfare, and tank capabilities that they didn't have before. And so that's certainly a turning point in the war. Another important turning point is, I think, that meeting in Tehran in 1943, where Roosevelt is able to get Stalin and Churchill to agree that we are going to create a United Nations, that there is going to be some international body that will be used to manage international affairs. Of course, the United Nations has a very mixed record, but I would argue it's one of the transformative elements of what comes out of the war. And then the third turning point I'd point to, the obvious one, the use of the atomic weapons, which takes us into a nuclear world that we weren't in before. So those would be my top three, but we could come up with more.
Great, thank you. Why was President Roosevelt the first to push the envelope and run for a third term. Had that ever happened before?
No, great question. Franklin Roosevelt was the first president to run for a third term. There were other presidents who had considered it. There was nothing in the Constitution until after World War II, until a constitutional amendment was passed after World War II prohibiting more than 2 terms. It was done because of Roosevelt after his death. But until that time, there was nothing prohibiting someone serving more than 2 terms. And George Washington had set a precedent, our first president, by saying 2 terms is enough. But that was not the law. Roosevelt ran a third time because the United States was still in depression in 1940 and the world was exploding around him. And he said, there's no choice. We need steady leadership. And the American public agreed in 1940. He then ran again in 44 in the midst of the war. And that, I think, historians are more critical of because he was quite sick at that time. He, of course, dies in the beginning of 1945. And that's one of the reasons. That's the real reason why Congress and the American public passed an amendment after the war, because it's very disruptive to have a president die in office, particularly during a war.
Was the instance of the U.S. kind of putting conditions on aid to the U.K., such as, the 4 freedoms, is that the first real significant instance of the U.S. kind of using its values to be conditional, the aid to be conditional upon the reception of values?
Great question. The United States had tried to do that before. We have a history. We just talked about this on the podcast, actually, 2 episodes ago, of providing aid from the early 20th century, especially to countries that had experienced earthquakes and other natural disasters. And we often did make that aid contingent on, for instance, opening your markets for American businesses, buying American products, things like that. But the aid, Joe, was so small. It didn't have much leverage. What makes this period so significant and such a turning point in this sense is now the United States is giving so much aid, and the recipients, the UK and the Soviet Union, are so dependent on that aid that the United States is able to turn the screws and get much more leverage than it would have otherwise. So I would say the aspiration to make aid conditional was not new, but the ability to force those conditions on the recipients, that's what's new.
Okay. What about, want to hear more about the kind of debates, because FDR clearly had to show some leadership to fight for not being isolationist during that time, right? So what were the debates like? What were, between the isolationists and those such as FDR and his administration that didn't want to go down that road?
Yeah, I mean, this is the part, and again, I want to talk about the history, not the present, but this is the part that really does echo our present, which is to say that members of Congress were often quite angry and quite aggressive in condemning what they saw as Roosevelt's misuse of presidential power. They were suspicious. Even members of his own party, but particularly members of the other party, Republicans, thought this Democratic president was going to get the United States into wars that they didn't want to be involved in. So they passed 3 sets of neutrality legislation to kind of handcuff the president. Neutrality acts that made it illegal, for example, for the United States to use its own ships to carry weapons for other countries. A neutrality act that made it illegal for the United States to sell arms to other countries. That's why Roosevelt has to give the arms away, because he's prohibited from selling arms. All kinds of legislation like that. So they handcuff the president, they limit the budget, and then they publicly attack him. Father Coughlin, who is this very prominent radio personality, I see him as the precursor to some of the personalities we see in the media today. Father Coughlin condemned Roosevelt for fighting a war on behalf of Jews. He said, we have to be careful. He's a Jew lover. He's from New York, and he's getting us into a war made by Jews. So there was anti-Semitic attacks. There were all kinds of things. Roosevelt had a very difficult time, and many times he had to back down. He famously, in 1937, gives a speech in Chicago where he says the United States has to get involved in the war. There's a terrible reaction to it. And he says, okay, I'll back away. So it's really, until Pearl Harbor, it's not only a debate, Joe. I mean, it's a deep political controversy between Roosevelt and Republicans and even some of his own Democrats, with a lot of name calling, with a lot of aggressive politics. It's a very rough political space he's in.
And speaking of the 4 freedoms, which I don't know how, I've watched a lot of World War II documentaries. We talked about it in high school. I do believe we touched on World War II, in from the U.S. perspective when I was in university, but I never heard about the four freedoms and their articulation as something that FDR did. So I'm curious. I mean, obviously, all four of these freedoms are very relevant, but also very kind of under some level of threat today in the United States. I'm curious, which of those was the most difficult to make the case for in the late 1930s, early 1940s in the U.S. context?
Well, yeah. So interestingly, that's a really great question, Joe. I think the freedom from want is the one that's most controversial today, right? Because people say, if there's freedom from want, does that mean the government has to feed you? Does that mean you have to get insurance from and there are different points of view on this. I think the freedom from fear was the one that was most controversial in this time because it involved clearly possibly the United States getting involved internationally, but also because it was seen freedom from fear was exactly the justification the fascists were using also, right? The fascist argument was, we are protecting you from those people you don't want around you. The German argument, right, was, look, we're surrounded by Russians and French and British, and they hate us, and they support Jews, and we need to actually make ourselves powerful to protect ourselves. We need Lebensraum, we need land. So the freedom from fear is the one that can come close to being a justification for fascism. I think that's a fair criticism, right? When it's misused, right? I can always justify taking away your rights in the interest of protecting you from some paranoid enemy that I claim we have, right? Internally or externally. And so that's why, for instance, those who were to the left of Roosevelt, including socialists, were very upset about that because they thought it justified police power against them. So that was the most controversial. And I think it still is controversial, but I think now the freedom from want question, what does that mean? What's the role of government? That was less controversial in the New Deal. Everyone wanted government help. Today, that's obviously more of an area of debate.
Okay, well, that's it for the questions. Is there anything you'd like to leave the audience with before we wrap up?
Well, I do want to say, and I wanted to say this at the end, and I got so caught up I forgot to say it. I do think the war shows, and maybe this is now trying to draw a lesson for today, that the United States and Russia and other countries can find a way to work together even when they have fundamental differences. There's no point in the war when Roosevelt and Stalin believed that they share the same ideology. They're very different, and everyone knows that. But they find a way to work together. And that's, I think, what we need to take today. History shows you don't have to be simpatico. You don't have to agree with your interlocutor to actually have a good working relationship. And I think the world of diplomacy is the world of building working relationships, even with people who we don't like, people who are different. And I think World War II shows that's possible.
Okay, great. Well, on behalf of the American Center and on behalf of the audience, thank you so much, Professor Suri, for taking the time to speak with us. It was enlightening. It was fascinating. Even I, who read a lot of U.S. history, learned quite a bit. So thank you so much.
And thank you for the work that you do and for having me.